Good morning and welcome to the second day of the IFTE hosted by Kazan Federal University. My name is Conor Galvin. I'm from University College Dublin and I have been asked to keynote this morning's session. It gives me great pleasure to do so. Now, the topic I'd like to talk to is that of reframing teacher education in the post-COVID moment. I'd like to look at the concept of shifting from crisis response towards a more sustainable transformation. And I'll do that by looking very briefly at one idea and then a little more detail at two further ones. The very brief idea I'd like to consider is crisis, what crisis is and how we can best understand it, though we've been living through it. So perhaps that's a bit academic as a definition, but I'd like to consider some elements of crisis because my argument would be that we in teacher education are not very good dealing with crisis. I'd then like to look at, in combination, the idea of responding to crisis and the concept of transition, moving forward to something different and hopefully something better. There are two thoughts that I'd like to start with. The first is that of the tall ship. Now, the tall ship is probably one of the most elegant forms of transport ever invented. It certainly lasted over the millennia. But there's a couple of ideas associated with tall ships that I'd like to return to as the session goes on, particularly that of the crew. And the second concept I'd like to put out there for you is that of the clubhouse and the social nature of learning that is often associated with clubhouses, the sorts of arrangements that they make, the sorts of support that they give, and how they give value to a learning experience. So that's the second thought, if you like, that I'm going to park for now and come back to as the session goes on. I said I'd look briefly at the concept of crisis, and I think there's probably few better ways of understanding crisis than the definition of crisis that's given by the United Nations Development Programme. They deal with crisis of a humanitarian nature and so on worldwide, but they have a very interesting take on what crisis is and how you move forward from it. I'd like to share some of that with you this morning. At its most basic, their concept of crisis is a sudden onset of distress or disordered function. And I can see no problem matching that to where we've been in teacher education over the last 2 years. Their concept of early recovery is, however, useful. They talk about focusing on strengthening resilience. They talk about rebuilding. They talk about focusing again on capacity, strengthening our capacity to do things. They talk about contributing to solving rather than making worse or allowing to continue the problems that may have caused the crisis in the first instance. So there's that sort of three circle that you see there: crisis through the crisis moment, the COVID moment in our case, and then this concept of renewal and recovery. What matters most from a UNDP perspective is not that you go through crisis or that you live through the moment. It's what you do now. It's what you do when crisis ends and you start to move forward or to transition to the next phase. And their argument would be that now is about building better. And in order to build better, we must be open to learning. And I would suggest that means learning from wherever it comes. Which brings us back to the clubhouse. Now, for those of you who know the clubhouse, these pictures will not be unfamiliar, but for those who are not, the Clubhouse network has existed for about 25 years. It's a global network. It focuses on making opportunities available to young people, particularly those who are from a disadvantaged background. And it does this through a series of out of school or after school or summertime type activities. You can imagine they deal with sort of 50, 60,000 kids on a daily basis. You can imagine what happened when the pandemic stopped these clubs. It was a huge problem for all involved. And how they reacted is what I'd like to look at, because my argument would be that we can learn quite a bit from looking at what the Clubhouse network actually did in relation to responding to the COVID crisis, and that there are some very good, though maybe hard, lessons in there for us as teacher educators. About 3 days ago, maybe a week ago now, the University of California at Irvine produced a report on exactly this, on the response of the Clubhouse network to the COVID crisis, what they did, why they did it, and how it worked. And there's some wonderful ideas that came out of that. I'd like to share some of those with you. Effectively, the UCI people argue that there are, if you like, five core ideas, but there are, of those, four would be seen as guiding principles that characterize how the network responded to the challenge of COVID. It was all about meeting youth where they are. In other words, very often we make the mistake of assuming we know, the young people don't. The argument that came out of the networks, the actual Clubhouse network, is that you have to listen to the younger people because it's their lived experience that actually makes the difference in terms of whether you can respond effectively to their situation or not. You have to tailor what you do for diverse groups and ages. It's not okay to talk about one single group of the youth. You have to think about them as people come from a different background, some closer to adulthood. You have to tailor what you do and what you provide in terms of the needs, and you have to assist the particular populations and communities that are involved. You have to build connections between existing assets. Despite the emergence of a huge amount of materials online, the big problem for young people was finding them. So connecting young people in the right way to the right sorts of assets became a huge challenge for the people in the Clubhouse network. And what they did was quite interesting, and we can learn, I think, from that. And finally, you have to tap into youth agency, peer-to-peer support. That means effectively listening to the lived experience, the kinds of things that they've gone through in their distress, amplifying the positive practice that has emerged, and working against the negative. So by tapping into youth agency and expertise, you can provide a critical technology, in this instance, technology-focused response that will help you engage with the young people and help move them to a better place in terms of their experience. Now, my thought actually was, when I read through this, was what if we actually transpose those ideas? What if we take those ideas and move them across into teacher education and how we deal with teacher education? And I've done a little bit of analysis on it, which I'm happy to share offline, but effectively, each of those four principles can be reduced to a single core idea. First, being open to ideas and to new ways of doing things. Secondly, doing diversity better, dealing better with the diversity of people that come to us for our services and the diversity of people we are ourselves. Build and use connections. So it's not just enough to build the connections, you have to use them effectively. And finally, it's all about trust, it's all about agency, it's all about solidarity in so many ways. Now, I would like to deal with all four of those, but time doesn't allow. So for today's session, I'm going to look very briefly at two of them. I'll start by looking at the idea of being open to ideas and new ways. And I would say that if you map that onto teacher education, there are a couple of guiding rubrics or principles that we might like to take on board. We should be thinking more about meeting people where they actually are. We should be thinking about not forcing our views on young student teachers, but listening very carefully to what they see as their requirements and their needs. And also the same would apply to members of staff. When we are, as a group of faculty or a group of staff, a community, when we're responding to a crisis, we need to make allowances for the fact that many of us are in very different places. So we need to meet each other where we are in terms of our abilities. We need to involve people in conversations from the start. This is more about doing things with colleagues, doing things with young people, our students, our teacher students, rather than telling them what they should be doing. And we should draw on the interests, the practices, and the lived experiences of those students if we want to be really effective in terms of responding to the challenges that emerge from a crisis such as the COVID one we've just been living through. Now, a very simple example of that comes from the Clubhouse network, where it was one of the kids themselves in the network that came up with the solution, the biggest challenge they were actually facing. How do we interact with each other in online spaces in ways that mirror and replicate what we've been doing in the real world? And they came up with the idea of connecting to the Discord network. Now, Discord is a kind of a kid-friendly learning space or informal learning space or place, if you want to call it that. And this became the central plank of the network response. Now, there's a couple of things that strike me as interesting about it. It's perfect for the job. It's simple, it's straightforward, it works very, very well, and it's attractive to the client group, to the kids that wanted to use it. And that made it the success it actually was in relation to um, the Clubhouse response to crisis. Now, you only know if something is working if you're able to value it, if you're able to draw on it. And I would suggest that we need to be able to draw on the interests and the practices that we see around us. And we need to be able to understand the value of what we're actually seeing in this changed world. There's some very interesting work going on, in fact, in Kazan in this area, in relation to working with groups of teachers who've been looking at YouTube and using YouTube as a content creation space and trying to get a sense of the values that underpin their involvement in that space, why they do it, how they do it, what's in it for them, and why they continue to do it, even though it's so difficult. Now, this work is being led by Xenia, a colleague, a young colleague from Kazan, Xenia Sivolova. And I think that that's worth looking at, particularly because it does a good job at showing how value can be assessed in relation to a complex online activity. The second area that I'd like to actually look at is that of building and using connections. Now, it's really about knowing what's out there, knowing who's out there, and then, in the mortal words of Rosa, our good friend and colleague, connecting, and connecting. If you really want to learn, then you have to work with what's there, and you have to work with the people that are doing interesting things on the edge. So there are some very good examples and interesting examples that came out of the COVID moment, which will help us, I think, as teacher educators to do just that. Here's one example of such an item. It's the blog that came out of the World Bank quite recently, which looks at the changing roles of teachers in relation to technology, how teachers actually applied themselves, how they use technologies. And there are incredible lessons here for us as teacher educators. This is what teachers globally found most effective in terms of their personal responses. We really do have to tap into that. We have to invest in that critical process of empowering young teachers, investing in building the necessary skills and the capacity to allow them and to allow us to exploit the more full potential of the remote and the blended learning that we will all be involved in going forward. And that's something that is not easy to do, but it's something that we really have to engage with as a learning community. The second point I would make perhaps would be in this area in terms of finding resources that we can learn from, is that there is a huge amount of resources that have been built up by organizations like EDEN, the European Distance Education Network. Now, this was my own go-to space in terms of surviving the COVID crisis. And what effectively EDEN has done is provide a series of practical webinars and networking opportunities that allowed educators globally to connect with each other and to talk to each other about the problems they were having and how they might solve those. So it focused initially on the day-to-day challenges of teachers and educators, and then moved on to consider the more broader institutional aspects. I think there's a huge wealth of information and data there that we would do well to tap into in terms of teacher education and thinking about new versions of teacher education as we move out of the pandemic moment. Then, of course, there are those resources and ideas that have existed previously. This is one that I'm sure a number of you would be familiar with, the ITE Lab module frameworks. The idea behind this is that a number of organizations and institutions have produced very flexible, very portable materials that can be used to help structure online interactions more effectively and more interestingly for student teachers. And I think that needs to be exploited much, much further as we move on from the current crisis. Opportunities to engage with other teacher educators, I think, are at the key or at the heart of this. And I would point to one particular example of this in the past couple of years, the Evaluate project, which focused on what is called telecollaboration. Now, this is interesting to me for a number of reasons, because it encourages exchanges, but it encourages virtual exchanges as much as real world exchanges. And they produced very straightforward manuals about how to do exchanges for teacher educators, how one group of teacher educators can work with another group. The manuals are produced in 5 languages, and they are absolutely brimming with wonderful, straightforward, effective ideas about what teacher educators can do when we work with each other in virtual exchanges and in projects that focus exclusively on the betterment, that focus exclusively on not the problems we've had, but on what we might do a little bit differently in order to move things to new realities. So I'm coming towards the end of this stage. What are the positive moves that we can make now? I would say there are 2 in particular. First, we have to become a lot better at listening. Now, I was attending an online webinar, like you do in COVID and post-COVID times, the other evening, which was given by the Scottish Education Research Association. And effectively, it was a launch event for a new teacher education network, which is open to colleagues from all over the world. But I found it very interesting because what we had was an English researcher speaking at a Scottish event to an international audience that came from just about every corner of the globe. And what she said resonated with me so deeply that I just said, I have to bring this to the attention of the group in Kazan. So her name is Professor Jean Murray. She would be well known to anyone who looks at and who thinks about teacher education in the European context particularly. And she made a number of very interesting observations about what we as teacher educators should think about doing as we emerge from the pandemic. She noted the persistence of pre-existing values. She noted that new practices were based on older ones. She noted that there has been an intensification of work patterns. Now that's interesting because we've all experienced this. We're all doing more. We're all working harder perhaps than we might have done in relation to teacher education prior to the crisis. And she asked the very, very important question, how sustainable is this? Can we keep doing this? I'm not going to give an answer, but I think it's interesting to think about the concept. She talks about teacher educators' professional learning and how we started to learn differently throughout the pandemic in ways that Jean would argue should stay with us as we move on from that experience. And she talked about how we use information technologies or ITs or ICTs. Previously, this has been known as a gap, a challenge for many teacher educators in terms of their professional learning needs. What has happened during the COVID period is that it has accelerated. We have all become a lot more proficient than we used to be, for better or for worse. And she also noted that there was a change in relation to the way we engage with research, how we do research and what we do with research over the pandemic period. I think that's quite important in terms of teacher education and where we go from here. But the one standout point that she actually made, and this is perhaps the takeaway from the whole idea of this network and where it's going. The one standout point is that it was the pre-existing values. It was what we did and believed and practiced previously, before the COVID, that made it possible for us to adapt so effectively as teacher educators to particularly to the simple emergency e-learning, and then to move beyond that, even as we were living through it, through the first and second wave. And I think that's a very important message. It's what we bring to the challenges of teacher education from our past, as much as what we've learned during the COVID days, that will shape future practice. My second point would be that we need what I would like to call tall ship thinking. Now, I've said a lot about this in other places, so I'm not going to overdwell it, but There are a couple of ideas that I think are important for teacher educators. We need to think in terms of the way that a crew works on a tall ship. If we're to really improve and change the way that we do things, if we're to really transition to a better place in relation to teacher education, we need to do more in terms of working together and sharing responsibility. We need to be involved more in the substantive decisions that influence and impact on our courses. That's an argument for becoming more involved in policy and policy work. And we need to think in terms of ourselves as interdependent workers doing interdependent work. There's so much to learn from colleagues in other places doing the same sort of work that we are doing, but we have to take a deep breath, be brave, and step into that world. Now, what we do with what we learn then reflects in the activities that we put forward in terms of our student teachers. And I think that the argument here is that they need to be deeper. So we need to focus much more than we ever did before on knowledge construction in relation to teachers. Our young student teachers and our colleagues, when we work with them, we should be encouraging the development of knowledge construction. We should be getting and encouraging people to apply their knowledge in contexts that are real and significant. And we should be thinking much more interdisciplinary than we perhaps did in the past. So we need to come out of our boxes and our silos. And the COVID moment has proved in many ways that we can actually do that and do that effectively. And the final point is we need to be much more open to the idea of open. Things like Creative Commons, things like open education sciences. This is something that needs to be a major point in what we do as teacher educators going forward. So in summary, I would say tall ship thinking is thinking that is values-based, that takes the best of the past and works with it. It involves deep learning and is led by deep learning. There's an element of innovation, but it's always innovation of value. It's not just innovating for innovation's sake, it's innovation for what we can do that changes and adds value to the experience of those we're working with. It is community-centered in the way that we are a community, whether it's groups of teacher educators working together or teacher educators with teacher students, student teachers, whatever. We are communities when we meet in online and offline spaces. We need to acknowledge that and work with it much more fully, because perhaps we haven't in the past. It needs to be culturally informed. We need to take on board the changing cultures of the people we work with, young and old, the changing opportunities that are offered by cultures such as the increased availability of good technologies and so on. And we need to be open and we need to be creative. I would suggest that that is not a challenge for most teacher educators, because we have proved beyond any shadow of a doubt whatsoever in the past 6, 10, 12 months that we are creative people. So effectively, I'm arguing for a combination of, if you like, clubhouse arrangements and tall ship thinking. I'm suggesting that pedagogical growth is about engagements and experiences. It's about openness. It's about diversity. It's about connecting one with the other. It's about learning in and through those connections. And it's about being agentive. It's about being the people who solve our own problems, or at least the people who lead on solving our own problems. And this, I think, will give us a form of teacher education practice that is renewed, reframed, and, if you like, reimagined in many ways, and will hopefully lead to possibilities for better teacher education in the future. My closing thoughts then. At the start, I offered you the concept from the UNDP that what matters is what we do now to build better. That no matter how bad the crisis was or what's coming down the road in the future, we need to think in the now, we need to think in the moment, and we need to work in the moment so that we are open in the moment to the sorts of learning that is necessary, and that we need to take that learning from wherever it comes. Over the last 20 minutes or so, I've tried to talk a little bit about these left field ideas, these ideas from unusual, slightly different places, new ways of thinking and engaging with those ideas. I have not been able to say much about doing diversity, but I think we need to just take it for granted that we need to be a lot more diverse and to do diversity better. I talked a little about building and using connections and communication and the role of that. What I'd like to have emphasized more is that it's about trusting, it's about being agentive, it's about exercising solidarity. with ourselves, among ourselves, and for ourselves. How often has a problem in the past 6 or 8 months been solved when we focused on not so much on content, but on contact? When we focused on the context, when we focused on making people feel that they were part of what was going on, making them feel that they had a role to play in the solutions. So that's part, I think, of exercising solidarity in a way that we've not perhaps done sufficiently well in teacher education in the past. The big takeaway for me from the readings I've done in preparation for this session would be that teacher education community values are strong, deep. They always put students at the center, and that they are truly values based in a moral sense. And in the oldest of words, perhaps, we need to be, and what we need to do now needs to reflect a more humanistic and more holistic way of thinking about who we are as teacher educators, what we do as teacher educators, and how that translates through into the work that we do with student teachers and those that we're working with in research settings and contexts. It's all about deep learning-led transformation. And that's not an easy thing to achieve, as we've seen. But there are some very positive points coming out of the COVID moment that I think we can build on for that. Is there a roadmap? Again, I will go back to one of my oldest sources on this one. No, there is no roadmap. There is no road per se. We make the road by walking. And I think that's what we're going to have to do increasingly in the next while as teacher educators working with young people in teacher education settings and contexts. That's more or less what I wanted to say in relation to the few ideas I've had in this space. I'd like to thank once again Professor Valeva, Professor Kalamullian, and the rest of the group that have invited me to speak at this session today. I would like finally, I suppose, to dedicate this talk very briefly to a young colleague who's unfortunately no longer with us. I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of a true teacher, a young woman who in many ways did what teachers do best and put her own safety and well-being above the dangers that were faced. And unfortunately, she paid the price for it. Those are my thoughts. Those are my reflections in relation to what we might do to make better use of what we've learned in the COVID moment, and what we might do as individuals and as groups of teacher educators working together to make the world a more interesting and a better place for those who work in teacher education to come, and for those who experience teacher education in all its forms. And I think I'd like to leave it at that.